My name is Christina Balboa, and I'm the director of the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management at the Mark School of Public and International Affairs, Baruch College, City University of New York. And that's a long title. Welcome to this webinar on building together mergers and sustained collaborations. I'm very excited for the discussion that's about to happen. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the context for which this is happening. Annually, the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management has had what we call Consulting Day, where we have one day of free consulting for nonprofits in the New York area, 45-minute sessions with expert consultants. Because we can't do that face-to-face, we're doing it over 2 weeks virtually. And so it's happening right now, and that's what I was trying to figure out as another meeting happening right now. So it's free nonprofit consulting for nonprofits in the area. We still have some slots open, some appointments open for this week. So I'm going to put that in the discussion box for today so you can see, so if you're interested or if you know of a nonprofit interested in getting free consulting, they can sign up. And so this webinar, we usually also have simultaneously some seminars happening, and we thought this one would be a really important one to have in this time to talk about mergers and sustained collaborations. Bin Chen is our moderator. I'm going to give it away to him in 2 seconds, but just to say that Bin Chen is a professor at the Mark School who has researched and written on mergers and emergency response for nonprofits. And so he is one of the 3 experts on this panel, and I'm so glad that he could be a moderator today. So welcome everyone, and thank you, Bin.
Thank you, Christina.
To our speakers.
Thank you, Christina, for your introduction. I'm going to moderate the discussion. And the COVID-19 pandemic has upended societies and all to the everyday life across the globe. Immediately, the nonprofit sector has to grapple with challenges of increasing service demands on the one hand, and the drying resource support on the other hand. So needless to say, the landscape of the nonprofit sector is going to be changed profoundly by our unprecedented circumstances. As our communities begin to recover from this pandemic, we as a sector need to think more about the sector's long-term survival, how to chart a path towards future under this new normal. So one important question we believe is to ask in this post-pandemic era, how nonprofit organizations can work together to overcome the hurdles ahead. So to weigh on these questions, today we're very glad to have 2 distinguished speakers, and Jessica Cavanaugh and Daniel Rabuzzi, to share their insights on this topic. And Jess Cavanaugh is a principal Sea Change. She leading the organization's grant-making advisory service activities, in particular 2 grants, Sea Change Low-Start Grant for Nonprofit Collaboration in New York Merger Acquisition and Collaboration Fund. These 2 grants make grant support to support the nonprofits that are exploring planning collaborations. And prior to Jess's employment with the Sea Change, she was an associate director at the CCS Fundraising. Before her transition to the nonprofit sector, Jess spent 6 years in the investment banking sector. Welcome, Jess, to our nonprofit world. She's a native New Yorker and a graduate of Cornell Universities. Our second panelist, Daniel Rabuzzi, is founder and lead consultant at Indigo Pheasant, a change management and merger advisory for social enterprises. For over 3 decades, Daniel has crafted-led and executed a significant organization change in business, government, education, and youth services. As executive director of Mouse, he successfully led the organization through a merger with another organization. With various leadership positions in several organizations, including Europe NYC, the Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship, and the Peter Drucker Foundation for Nonprofit Management. Daniel started his career in corporate finance at the Manufacturer Hanover Trust Company. He earned his PhD in history at Johns Hopkins Universities. So welcome to our seminar on building together mergers and sustained collaborations. So our seminar will be about 1 hour long, and I'm going to leading the discussion with questions to these two panelists. And at the end of the seminar, we put aside 15 minutes for question and comments. You can type in your question into the chat room. At the meantime, if you have any urgent questions you want to raise, you're also welcome to and type into the chat room. I will constantly monitor chat room and forward the questions to panelists. Okay, let's get started. So most of us have some idea about the mergers, even though there's a much more nuanced meaning behind the mergers. Sustained collaboration is a little bit new concept to us. So I want to ask the two panelists to clarify, give us some idea, what do you mean by mergers and sustained collaborations? Either of you can start, Daniel or Jess.
Great.
I'm going to defer to Jess because Jess has a fantastic slide that really spells this out.
Yeah, so hopefully Ben is able to share it. But hi,
Yes.
everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It is wonderful to see everybody in their little boxes on the screen. And thanks to Baruch for setting this up. Ben and Daniel, it's great to be able to share this time with you. Before I jump into what do mergers and sustained collaborations in particular mean, just a quick introduction to Sea Change. For those of you who are new to us, we're a nonprofit focused exclusively on helping other nonprofits work through their complex challenges. And over the last decade, we've been grant makers focused exclusively on the area of helping nonprofits work through mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures, programmatic, and administrative partnerships. And so without even having to look at this slide, I've defined what we consider sustained collaborations. It's when two or more nonprofits work together to change the way in which they do business. And so as we talk about why and how this activity can help both promote financial sustainability and deepen the impact of organizations, we want to think about the entire range of activities that organizations could and should be considering. And so thank you for sharing this slide, Ben. What we view as critically important to the sustained collaboration piece is that organizations are forming a partnership in which they're really able to work and learn from and with each other. And so as you'll see, there are short-term informal things, programmatic partnerships that last for the duration of some funding. There are collective impact efforts, really things designed to be a one and done. That's not the activity that we're here to talk about today. Today, we're talking about ways of working together that are much more long-term, perhaps permanent, that really help deepen the impact and further the mission of the nonprofits that are participating. Daniel?
Exactly what she just said. I think, yeah, just to put the dot on the I, the nature here is how permanent. There's a permanency about this that we don't often think about in our routine day to day. If we're, and speaking as somebody who recently was an executive director myself, you know, you're thinking ahead, maybe a quarter at most, maybe to your gala next spring. So this is sustained is a key adjective here, just to sort of leave it at that, which may segue into the question, well, why are we even talking about this now? Why think about something that may be, quote, permanent, or at least as permanent as things can be in this world at this time? What's special about this time?
Yes, I think it's a very good follow-up question we can discuss is that actually mergers and collaboration are not new to the nonprofit sectors. According to my research, even prior to this pandemic, the cumulative rate of rate of merger in the nonprofit sector is about 1.5%, as compared to 1.7% in the for-profit sector. So my follow-up question is why mergers and sustained collaboration are particularly relevant to this particular extraordinary time?
Happy to start. So at Sea Change, we take a particular view, and that is that this type of activity helps organizations to deepen their impact and build stronger financial models. This is all important because in a world of limited philanthropy, decreasing resources, and where organizations have either decided to respond by building up their activities in response to the COVID crisis, and or shrink their activities in some areas that perhaps are not directly relevant and can't be produced today. So for example, after school and summer camps, getting organizations to focus on the things that they are good at that are core to their mission and helping them plan for a way to adjust to the COVID recovery. For example, there may be some organizations who simply don't know whether or not they'll be able to come back. It's a difficult conversation to have, but I think right now, trying to think about ways in which they can use this type of activity to preserve and sustain valuable programs within the community is deeply important to keeping the social safety net that we enjoy.
Daniel?
Yeah, I think there's at least three vectors. I mean, it's interesting, Ben, to talk historically. I mean, certainly the concept of joint venture merger acquisition, obviously not foreign at all to the nonprofit sector. Having said that, most of the mergers that we've seen, acquisitions, tend to be, I mean, remember, nonprofit includes universities, hospitals, very large players who are tantamount to being for-profit, certainly in many of the ways they operate. I would posit that for smaller nonprofits, which is where most nonprofits sit, you know, when you're $1, $2, $5, $10, $20 million, which is all small by corporate standards, you know, these sorts of more sustained collaborations are in fact not quite so common. It's a discussion that's sometimes difficult, or at least foreign altogether to have. Not least because the strength of most smaller nonprofits is precisely because you have a fierce sense of identity. You often have a founder still in the picture, or a founding team. That's the benefit, that's the strength. So having said that, I think to Jess's excellent points, three vectors. One, look, we are in economic times that nobody on this call has seen before, no matter how experienced you've been. And many of us on this call have been through a good number of business cycles. We ain't seen anything like this before. You have to go back literally to the Great Depression to see some of the signs we're seeing now. So that's one. As a result, you've got, I think, two different channels. One for certain groups, as Jess was noting, they literally cannot provide certain services. They must be thinking very creatively. If we can't provide the services, and remember, it isn't just a nice to have, this is mission, right? We're nonprofit people. We exist for a mission. If you cannot meet that mission, even if for reasons outside your control, you must begin to think about, as a board, as a fiduciary duty, because this is all in that ambit of the fiduciary duty of the board, right? If we can't meet this mission, even for reasons outside our immediate control, how can we in fact meet it, possibly through other and potentially permanent forms of structural collaboration, sustained collaboration. And I think the third vector is going the other direction. Again, Jess alluded to this. There are certainly groups that have been thinking about doing such things for quite some time. I think that the current crisis will accelerate, we're seeing some of this already, accelerate some of that good thinking. It's not that people hadn't thought about it, it's just that it was always item number 22 on a very crowded board agenda. You know, your quarterly board meeting, you get to what you need to do for this quarter, next quarter, maybe next year. Suddenly things like merger acquisition, which were possibly in your, suddenly get accelerated to maybe your top 10 on the board agenda meeting. So I'm going to stop and say, to me, the key right now is fiduciary duty to mission and risk identification and mitigation, as to why it becomes something we need to talk about much more forcefully than we typically have for the smaller nonprofits. Different ballgame when you're talking about large hospital systems and that sort of thing.
I would add to that, if I could.
Go ahead.
I think in this moment, business as usual may not continue. We don't know what recovery is going to look like, and proactive conversations, exploring how you might be able to continue to serve the community, because that's what this is all about, exploring how you can continue to serve the community,
Yeah.
and maintaining those resources in a way that provides as little disruption as is possible is very, very important right now. And in this moment in particular, just knowing that the timeline for these transactions can take anywhere between 6 to 18 months for organizations to work through, having an exploration discussion where you're just thinking about what potential scenarios could you work through, what is the definition of possible, is incredibly helpful to mitigate the damage done and in rebuilding through the recovery.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
if I could just strongly support that, and in fact, mention two resources in a general way that can be very helpful, and they emanate from the two parties involved here, right? So Sea Change, Jess and her colleagues put out a powerful 8-pager end of March already. I think it's Tough Times Call for Tough Action. If you haven't seen it, it's free on their website. They didn't pay me to say this, folks. I'm telling you, it's really good stuff. It helps frame what we're going through, and they were out, one of the first out with this in March already. And likewise, Professor Emeritus Fred Lane from Baruch Marx Center came out with a checklist of nonprofit crisis management, was published in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, I think a week later. So I would just note, if anybody on the call hasn't seen those two, those are just good basic framing documents for what are not normal times, and where some very, to crib Sea Change's language, tough times demand tough action. And in fact, you will do a disservice to yourselves and those you serve if you don't explore, at the very least, some of the contingencies that need to be explored, not least given Jess's excellent point about time horizon. Let's even say hypothetically that you already know in your heart, gee, yeah, it would be great if we could find a partner. I think we may even know somebody and we could get together. That would be wonderful. You don't just do that on the back of an envelope stating the obvious and do it in the course of a weekend. So if you're at that stage already of thought, you have a long way to go on the mechanics and logistics, and time may not be in your favor if you wait too long. Just saying.
So good. And I just have a question from participant Melissa, but I would love to hear more about how you go about decision-making process for deciding to go into a merger, sustained collaboration, etc. What is the process look like? What do you need to think through? How do you evaluate yourself as an organization? How do you evaluate the potential partnerships? I think this is actually nicely transition to our next question. That is, how should the process started? Okay. Good.
Daniel, as a practitioner, I'll let you take the lead on this one.
Yeah, thank you. But I will use just one of the points you were just making. I think it begins and ends with those whom you serve. Jess, you were talking about community, which is, in the broadest sense of whichever community your organization is serving. And again, it all comes back to mission. This is the fiduciary duty of the board, and more broadly, that's important legal, but in the general sense, to begin to think about merger, it begins and ends with those whom you serve. And if whatever action you take is not going to most optimally help those whom you serve, then in fact you've breached your mission, or you're at least you're suboptimal to your mission. And to me, that has to be the pole star. To do it otherwise would put the horse in the cart the wrong way around. I think it's related a little bit to that aphorism we all like to use, but I happen to think it's really true. The one attributed to Peter Drucker about how culture eats strategy for breakfast. They're not opposed, obviously, but the point is that you need to be deeply enmeshed in your decision making in the culture of the community that you serve. Otherwise, I think it's a technocratic exercise that most likely won't turn out well in the end. So I would say first and foremost, take a hard look. Assume that you don't have enough money. I mean, in the best of times, as nonprofits, we really don't ever have much money. So that's sort of the given. That's like saying it's raining out. Okay, so it's raining. Now we've got a force 5 gale that's hit us, so it's even worse for us. But okay, leave that aside as well. I would suggest to you that you should be having conversations now. What will be best for the community that I serve, and work your way through that. Um, it- by the way, although it says merger advisory in the very subtitle of the little consultancy I've set up and all that, there's no given that that would be the tool for everybody. So just to be really clear to people on the call, you should not enter this already thinking, oh, wow, I guess we're really going to have to do something like that. Possibly not. But you do need a decision-making process. And I would say if you're not talking quickly now with your lead stakeholders being first and foremost your beneficiaries, that's a flaw in your premise from the get. And I don't think that ends well. I'm going to pause there. I have a lot more I could say, but I want to hear what Jess has to say. Jess, of course, sees tons of these deals all the time, so has a very broad perspective.
So thank you, Daniel. Building on Daniel's point, when I get this question from nonprofits, and I'm going to assume that everyone who's dialed in is already thinking about it, but perhaps your boards are not, or perhaps there are a couple of people on your leadership team that are not. And so what I would say first and foremost is, with that header, mission first, go into a room and do a couple of things to align yourself internally, importantly. So one, what are your assets? What are the things that you're good at? What are the things that you need to preserve, both hard and soft? So do you have financial assets? Do you have an asset in your network? Are your board members particularly valuable? Sorry for those folks who feel like they're now a commodity. Are your foundation relationships very valuable? The contracts, the licensings that you have, anything that you have, hard and soft, in your asset column, write it down. And forgive me for breaking this down into this tactical way, but I'm a working parent. Everything needs to be straight line for me. In the second column, what are your challenges or the things that you're solving for? This can be both in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. And I know it's very difficult to think about the long term right now, given the immediate crisis that we're in. But I promise you, if you take the time to just align yourself around that, it will all accrue to you at the end. So on the challenge side, obviously the financial stuff that's going on right now, it's a good moment to think program by program. And perhaps there's a piece of something that you were doing that wasn't deeply critical to your mission or wasn't core, right? And I hate to break the world into core and non-core, but right now, in a moment of crisis, everything should be about what is core to your mission. So financial challenges, programs that perhaps were nice to have, but not core. Perhaps there's a geographic challenge or a new demographic challenge that you're trying to solve for. Write it all down. In column 3, who are your partners? Who are the organizations that you know well? Who are the organizations that you trust? Who are the organizations where your board members, your staff, your leadership team have relationships? Throw it all on there. You'll probably get 15 to 20 names. Take a step back, look at it again, circle and star the ones where you have the closest relationship. 15 names probably becomes 5, maybe 3. That's probably the pool to start thinking. And then look at those names against, excuse me, your assets and your challenges. Who's going to help you solve your challenge? Who's going to help you value your asset? Column 4, what are the things that you must have? And this is really, really, really important. This is where you get into brand. This is where you get into leadership and governance construction. So for example, if you're a founder and you still want to be involved in what your organization may look like through a partnership, you should note that here. All of those nice to haves, keep it there. Are you a community-based organization that makes decisions through collective decision-making? Or are you an organization that works from the top and trickles things down? Even defining that approach, very important, because that all leads to culture, which is something that people trip up in at the end, which we'll get to. The next column, take a look and be honest with how much time you have to make these decisions. And this all goes back to Daniel's point on cash and patience and how long these things take. So again, reflecting back that under normal circumstances, 6 to 18 months is what you should budget. to work your way through a reasonable diligence process, to get people comfortable, to build the trust, to negotiate on some of those tougher must-haves. In a crisis, you might not have that much time. You might emerge from this in June and say you have 3 months. Well, then you better look at your partnership list and really think about where you have the strongest relationships. So be honest on that time column. And then the last thing I would say, who needs to know that you're having these conversations? Right now, and we always recommend not announcing a wedding until you're pretty sure it's going to happen. But at this moment, because you're in conversations with funders, because you're in conversations with staff and everybody's nervous, take the time to think about who needs to know and be involved in these discussions, because these discussions will change everything. So once you as executive director, as a board member, as a foundation leader, have done that work, then circulate it with your leadership team internally. Call a special board meeting, have that discussion, bring a whiteboard, or because we don't have whiteboards anymore, just a piece of paper with some notes and jot things down. But try to facilitate that discussion, because if you're an organization with 25 board members, you probably have 26 opinions on what the mission is, the different variations, what's core versus not. Yeah. Knowing who you are first, is the most important step towards starting to think about whether or not these types of sustained collaborations can be important and meaningful to your long-term story.
Okay.
Can I just add on? I mean, that's,
yes,
yeah, a couple of things. Thanks, Jess, so much. That a couple of points I would just double down on. The concept of the program audit, which is essentially what you're talking about, right? Look, let's be frank, if you've been around for any period of time, almost inevitably or invariably, there's some form of mission creep. And so here you are 10, 20, 30, 40 years into your existence, and there are almost certainly things that you were doing with staff members and board members and some funders that are probably deeply wedded to them. I'm gonna fight you tooth and nail, but the fact is, when you talk to beneficiaries, when you really take that hard look, go to the whiteboard and figure out, is this truly core? I mean, you can carry it and it's core when times are as good as they were until, let's say, February. But in the current situation, you've got to look really hard. So that the program audit concept of, and by the way, I mean, almost certainly, again, there will be certain members of your community and your staff, your board, who feel strongly in favor of those. So none of this is easy, right? Nobody said this sort of thing would be easy, but it's absolutely necessary now. And I would say there's no hidden benefit. I mean, this is a terrible situation, but almost certainly you've had discussions about some of those program elements before. And now certain arguments no longer carry much weight. Okay, so that's one point I would just emphasize. I think, and it really is it's in a room together with what we used, the old whiteboard or whatever we're going to use with Zoom or whatever. That's one. The other thing that jumps out at me is, there is almost certainly going to be differences between what staff and board view, not just individual staff members, individual board members, but how the board and the staff view their role in this. And there's no easy answer to this except to constantly remind people that first and last, the board has the fiduciary duty for the organization. But I'm just highlighting already, if you're thinking, each of you is thinking, if you're not a board member yourself, or you're thinking about your board members, just this may be this is the highest and deepest level simultaneously of fiduciary duty. The board itself has almost certainly not done something like this. Ironically, many of them, if they're business folks, probably done this sort of thing in their day jobs, but they somehow aren't as aware of what this really entails for us in the nonprofit sector. So there's a double degree of difficulty here. You need to be educating your board as well. Many board members, right, are there because they love the mission, they love making a site visit with you, hopefully they're happy donors, they like going to the gala. Suddenly they're confronted with something that's truly existential, or at least very potentially existential for them. You're going to have to spend some time educating the board to its own responsibilities. I can't tell you how many board members I've run across who, if they ever got a board orientation, have long since forgotten it. So just a reminder that there's a lot of that happening too. And then the third point I would just emphasize that Jess has already made, which is about the communications. You remember, this is like, there's the tree falling, and then there's a noise it does or doesn't make. And there's the act of this sustained collaboration, all happening within legal and accounting and regulatory frameworks, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also the story, the narrative that drives it, both drives what happens, and then the story that's told about it and how well you can or cannot control that. Who gets to know what, when? Oh, extremely, extremely difficult, frankly. I mean, it's an art, not a science there.
And it's been our experience that that piece in terms of communication is the most challenging, at least in the beginning, because you need to be able to figure out where your best partners are, whether that is divesting a program, whether that is embarking on an administrative or programmatic partnership, whether that is a true merger, and understanding the sensitivities that people have to change, particularly in this great moment of uncertainty, will help you as you think about messaging and creating a reason to celebrate at the end. Right? All of this is to try to build organizations to a point where they can celebrate either the preserving of a mission, the sustaining of a program, the next chapter in their life, whatever that may be.
So, I mean, my take from Daniel and Jess' discussion seems to be, first of all, the nonprofit, it's really important for them to reevaluating, working very hard on their mission, by identify the core service and programs. And also, secondly, mapping their internal, external environment to identify the stakeholders as well as these potential partners. So I think you also alluded to the issue is, on the one hand, you do not want to announce the wedding before you make it, you're really sure about it. But on the other hand, you want to be inclusive about the whole conversation. This is the challenge of facing us. You talk about the communication strategies. How are you going to communicate the message to the key stakeholders? We have another question from the audience. What role, or if any, should a foundation play in starting some of these conversations for nonprofits or facilitating the process? Again, this is also nicely transitioned to our next question. That is the role of the funding agencies, broadly defined, foundations, government funding agencies, how they play the role in this whole process.
Daniel, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in first.
Please.
Great. Thank you for that question. It's almost as though you're reading our question prompts, which are secretly displayed on our screens at home. The role of foundations and funders is very tricky in this. On the one hand, funders, whether or not they mean to, can exert an undue influence on these processes and encourage perhaps unnatural partnerships. I think it's very difficult for a foundation to play a truly, or a funder to play a truly active role in connecting organizations under the header of partnerships will help you. The most successful foundations have been, in promoting this work amongst their grantees and or their networks, have been the ones that have simply hosted conversations among subsects of their grantee communities and or just gotten people in touch. Most of these transactions are born, the best of these transactions are born of organic relationships built on trust. Many of them start out as programmatic partnerships between the leaders. Many of the leaders already know whom their best potential partners could be. And so as a funder, opening up the network, creating instances where your grantees can get together to have these conversations, perhaps under the auspices of risk management, perhaps under the header of let's talk about recovery, and making it okay for organizations to begin these very tense, understandably, very tense and hot and difficult discussions is good. The other thing that they can do is provide risk capital. And so this is a plug for Sea Change. So at Sea Change, we run something called the New York Merger and Collaboration Fund. And that is supported by Altman, Clark, Booth Ferris, the New York Community Trust, and the Heckscher Foundation for Children, plus a handful of committed individual philanthropists who deeply care about New York. And what we do is when organizations are having these initial discussions, rather than being a nonprofit being forced to call up an important funder and say, I'm thinking about a partnership. I'm not quite sure how it's going to work. I don't know whether or not it makes any sense right now, but I do want to spend the next 6 months rolling up my sleeves and really digging into the diligence to see if it makes sense. Can you give me some money? They just call us. And we provide them with funding to help bring in a facilitator like Daniel or some others in the city to facilitate that process, to mediate the discussions and help organizations work towards a decision. And so just to summarize, because that was a long and rambling answer. Number 1, promoting discussions among your grantees. 2, providing risk capital in a really open way. If organizations come back and say, we're not going to partner, be okay with that. Or 3, just direct them to NIMAC and we'll do what we can to help facilitate the process.
Daniel?
Yeah, so first I just have to say, and again, it's not a paid advertisement, but I think it's good for folks to know that the merger that I was part of leading at Mouse with Code Interactive, frankly, wouldn't have happened without the wonderful support of Sea Change Capital, the grant pool, the capital pool that Jess refers to. It's an interesting thing. If you come out of the corporate finance world, the idea that 2 companies wouldn't merge because they couldn't afford the legal fees is it's ludicrous, right? It's literally nonsensical. You mean to tell me you couldn't get these 2 great companies together because nobody could afford the legal fees? Well, as we all know in the nonprofit sector, we're that cash strapped. So I would just make the point that Sea Change has been an absolute pioneer in this, not just in New York, but nationally in something, for want of a horseshoe, they're there to make sure that transaction costs at the very least do not stymie what would otherwise be good deals. So that's important for everybody on this call to recognize that it's one of the first things your treasurer of the board is going to ask you, right? Hey, well, how much does all this cost? And you do have to pay for external, there's lawyers, there's the CPA, and a whole lot of other things we could talk about. But at any rate, that's a very important point. More broadly about funders, so that's a thank you to Jess and her team. More broadly about funders, I completely agree with Jess. Well-meaning foundations, we're certainly aware, and they're well-meaning. They're trying to make things happen. They're trying to be matchmakers, if you will. I agree completely that the best of these sustained collaborations with great success rates will be those that emerge organically. I think that's the word Jess used. I think it's a great one, from the organizations themselves, and typically from within the communities they serve. People work side by side in various less formal collaborations. If there's one thing that characterizes the nonprofit sector, we're a friendly bunch. How many of us are in this coalition and that coalition and this group and that group? We get to know each other pretty well. So I think the lead role for the funders is that you want their blessing, and you are never, I can't emphasize this enough, you really are not going to attempt to come to your respective boards for even that level of approval without having your respectively your lead funders aware and on your side, right? You want their blessing in this, that they're validating in a general sense of what you're doing. That's you might call it a sort of an implicit veto right, I think is fair to grant to at least your largest funders. But I don't think that they should really play, and that's a role they should be playing, I think, but they don't need to be playing the proactive, let me get you together role. So agreeing fully with Jess on that.
So my take from their discussion seems to be the role of the funder should be first the facilitators rather than the imposing any merger acquisition on the nonprofit. Secondly, they need to provide a certain resources to help with the process. Right. So I have another question here.
Ben, can I just to be more explicit about something, and I think Jess alluded to it, and I know some of the colleagues on the call well enough to know it's probably in their minds. Some of this has broader implications for us. There, to speak candidly among colleagues, right? There are social justice, equity issues that can be involved if anytime you have large pools of capital, even well-intentioned, intervening or imposing, what might even be logical, but if they're not of and from the particular community of the organizations, and we do know that, the larger foundations, particularly, both staff and their histories aren't always initially aligned with some of the communities with whom many of us work, so on and so forth. I don't want to belabor it, but I do think it's an important point, again, to reinforce Jess's point that, even colleagues who mean well may end up trampling around in the salad, inadvertently appearing to be interlopers or attempting to impose a will. And the blunt fact is, when you have capital, and most of us in the nonprofit organizational sector, we don't have it. We are beholden to them. So I think one key takeaway from this webinar should be helping our funders understand, and I know Sea Change has done an excellent job of making sure the funders, the foundations they work with, understand this, is that we want
They came to us with that understanding.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
We are lucky to work with evolved funders.
You continue, yes, yes, you continue to validate and reinforce their initial thinking. But in any event, again, not to go too far down the line with it, but I think it's important to keep that in mind. And that will be very important over this next stretch, because it's precisely the least resourced communities, this is a tautology, that are the most distressed. I mean, we're all stressed right now. I mean, it's bad for everybody, but it's more bad for some. And it's precisely the communities that are in most need of support who have, rightly will be most sensitive to outsiders of any sort. Again, even well-intentioned ones that saying, hey, you should be doing this. I'll give you money to do this. You have to be careful of that.
Right, and Daniel, to your point, and then what this really gets at is that these transactions are built upon a shared understanding and a shared value system that all ties to the culture of an organization. And so in normal course, I would say, how can an organization outside of your own direct you to another without deeply knowing your culture? And so the way in which you're going to evaluate partnerships right now, particularly because you can't be in person, the importance of existing relationships, previous experience is just going to be underscored, because it's going to be difficult to get to know new people, even if they align on paper, vis-a-vis this digital interaction.
Uh-huh.
So we have a question from the audience. I think it's more specific. So how does financial picture influence this process? For example, what if the core programs are the ones that are most financially vulnerable, or the ones to which the board or constituents or staff have the strongest attachment, but may not be as core as others? How do you manage that tension? Very good question.
That's a great question. And when we've seen it come up in the past, this is where scenario planning comes into play. So it's doing the program audit that Daniel so wonderfully discussed earlier, and then overlaying it with, okay, here's core, here's non-core. Importantly though, here's how the financials of these programs stack up. What do we need to do? Where do we earn the money? Sorry to speak so crassly about it. And how can we do that in a way that best complements the programs? So all of us know that the funding comes in, some funding helps cover the deficits in other program areas, and working through the different scenarios to get you to a place of comfort is how many organizations approach that. That's going to be much tougher now, much tougher now. But as you think about your administrative needs, your fixed costs, your facility needs, how do those line up? And are there programs that perhaps aren't core, but aren't so far off mission that you can keep them, that generate funding to help offset some of the deficit in your core programs? And if you work through the scenarios and you just can't get there, then it's time to perhaps start having some of the more difficult conversations around true organizational partnerships with entities that'll be able to take over those programs. Take over is such a terrible word. That will be able to help you preserve and sustain those programs, keeping true to your mission, true to your culture, true to your values.
Daniel? Oh,
Yeah, I would just add there's a word we haven't used enough here, maybe not at all, and that's complementary. In other words, and this gets down to a lot of pencil pushing on the finances, but often, what I find often is groups say to me, oh, we would like to get together with these folks, but they basically do what we do already. And I say, well, let's really peel back under the hood. Typically, one of you is doing, even if there are things that are both core, one of you, for whatever reason, is simply a little bit better, more efficient, more effective. There are ways to measure this, right? We believe in metrics, than X. And it may be that, this is the group that, let's just say for sake of argument, they're more market oriented. They're just really good at getting out in the field. And there's another group that, although they're doing something similar at the top level, turns out they're actually better at the creation of curriculum, more behind the scenes, more back office, if you will. Are there ways in which you can, in fact, in the complementary, they may, again, from an overall perspective, some funders will say, yeah, they're both in youth development. They're both after school programs. That may well be true, and you may even think of yourselves that way, of course, but underneath, really drilling deep, you may discover that, oh wait, X is better at the engineering design piece, and Y is better at, for lack of a better word, sales, marketing, and sales. These business terms are valid. There's always a back of house, front of house in any organization, right? But you don't, and again, in normal times, we don't often think as much about that, and we are a little shy in the nonprofit sector of putting things in those kind of categories. Jess and I are both, always apologizing a little on this call. Oh, we shouldn't say earned, but the fact is, it is earned, and we need to be that sharp about it right now to say, hey, guess what? A merger in this case, or a joint venture at the very least, may make sense, because although at the top level you look relatively the same, which is good fundamentals, it's program to program. How do you stack up, line up? And that's hard, because in most organizations, even looking at themselves in that way, most people just don't have the time. Suddenly people are going to have to make that sort of time, given the pressures we're all under right now.
and we have another question from the audience, kind of related to what Daniel said. A universal challenge is our limited ability to deliver our program digitally. Do you see this solved through partnerships? How does one identify such partners?
Daniel, this built so wonderfully off your last point. Do you want to take it?
Yeah, I'm chuckling only because I'm sure, like all of us on this call, we're all on Zoom or Hangout all day now. So on the one hand, in the last 2 months, we've all learned that digital is at least a quarter loaf and a proxy for many things, and that's all great. I should say, by the way, just as a backdrop, I was the CEO of one of the first wholly online universities, entirely state-owned, public sector, 20 years ago. So I've been in this world for a long time. Obviously, a stalwart believer in a digital edge being applied to ever more things. So when I now say what I'm about to say, it's not because I don't believe in digital. I've lived my life for 20 years this way. I think coming out of this, in fact, what we're going to see is that there are absolutely, just as we've deemed essential and non-essential workers, apparently none of us on this call are essential, right? It's an interesting thing if you think about it. I'm not essential, whereas the person who's cashing me out at the grocery store is. There are certain things that, and this cuts to the core of nonprofit human service delivery, that we cannot digitize. And I think one of the realizations coming out of this crisis will be that we need to double down, in fact, on things that must be done in a non-digital environment. So I'll just leave that as one note. To the extent that folks say until we have the vaccine, until, et cetera, the public health issues, we're going to have to come up with some digital quarter loaf. Here's what I would say: if the decision is that you're going to go that route, it's a make or buy decision. And as somebody who's spent 2 decades internally building large digital platforms and delivery systems, I would say you absolutely should be looking right now for somebody who's already built one. You do not, I mean, in the best of times, you don't want to be doing this on your own. Right now, you absolutely don't want to. So if you're saying to yourself, I don't know how we're going to do our service delivery in a digital fashion, but by gosh, we're going to have to for at least some period of time, that's your decision, then yeah, you should be drawing up right now a list of folks that you could collaborate with in some fashion, whether it's straight licensing or all the way through some form of merger with somebody who's got a great tool. Because the development process on that is a couple of years at least, and more to the point, it's a lot of money, and it's probably way outside your core competency, your wheelhouse. I'll pause there. So two big barriers, in my opinion. Well, one's an opportunity to double down on human face-to-face, because that's what ultimately the nonprofit sector does better than anybody, in my opinion. But insofar as we can't do that right now, yeah, don't try to create digital tools yourself if you have no experience in that area.
We have another question from the audience, and oh, that's good. We have been in conversation with another 4 organizations to create a collaborative merged structure among the 5 of us to avoid the program duplication and streamline operational functions so that we can be more financially sustainable. We're now discussing identifying areas that are similar and those are different. Common expenses such as health insurance, financial management. At what point do you think we should involve an attorney or a funder? These are very critical questions now.
Yeah.
That's a Jess question.
Yep. So please call me as a funder.
Everybody.
Call me now, right after this call. At 1:10, I'll be expecting your email. In terms of involving the lawyer, a couple of things first. To the extent that you can, try to draw up a term sheet that commemorates what you've already agreed to. And then once you've got that in place, with some blanks here and there, because not everything will be agreed to up until this point, then bring in the lawyers to help formally structure the deal. The way in which these transactions can differ from their for-profit brethren is that on the for-profit side, you lawyer up right away, you get your bankers involved right away, and you really dig into the negotiations, particularly on the structuring side. For these types of transactions, it's often helpful, again, to just have that term sheet outlined first, and then bring in the lawyers for the structuring piece, because there's lots of ways that can get you to, in effect, legally do what you're trying to achieve on the program side. So you can, then I think this is to your beginning point where the level of nonprofit mergers seemed particularly low. That's because many of these transactions don't actually show up as mergers. There are parent subsidiary relationships, there are memorandums of understanding, there are programmatic and administrative partnership agreements that get stapled together to, in effect, get you the benefits of working together in this organizationally close and deep way, but are legally separate and distinct.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, since we haven't talked about this at all, baked into the 6 months to 18 months that Jess referred to earlier, just a reminder that if one goes into the formal merger acquisition, route, you're operating within a regulatory framework. That means, we've talked about your stakeholders, your immediate stakeholders, your community, your staff, your board. Well, remember that once you get the 2 boards to agree, there's a petition then to the Attorney General's office, right? So there's a whole level of legal framework. But coming back to Jess's point, there are a number of other arrangements, the shared services agreements that we've seen and other sorts of things where you are not required. It's the different legal structures, but you need a lawyer to help you on that side too. As a former ED, I would tell you that at one point I had 3 pro bono, 1 under retainer, but I had 4 different law firms working for us, not for the merger and acquisition. One was actually specialized, but so I'm as a former banker too. I mean, I think calling your lawyer earlier than later is probably not a bad thing, even if it's just to be sure you don't need them. But I'd rather find out I don't need them early than finding out that, oh gosh, you should have called me 3 weeks ago. The same is true, of course, on I mean, look, the law, the legal framework and the numbers simply have to be what I call right, tight, and proper. So clearly, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a CPA, but I'm sure work very closely with them. You need to be sure early. And if it's for them to say, oh, we don't need to get involved yet, that's good to know early. You'd hate to find out again, because that just slows everything up. And due diligence is not just something we chuck around lightly. There are real legal and fiduciary implications for that if you get that far down the pike. So just a reminder that, that stuff really matters. But in this way, you wouldn't want to come to Jess, I don't think, with a package or proposal that didn't include, I won't speak for you, but I'm sure you would appreciate seeing some conversation had been had with, the financial and legal advisors that you already have in place prior.
What I would add to that, and thank you for all of that, Daniel, because I agree. Maybe you don't be honest with the resources that you do need. Everyone is doing this exploration, these negotiations. They're working through the thinking of these sustained collaborations off the side of their desk in the limited free time that they have.
That's true. There you go.
Which feels particularly limited right now because the world occasionally feels like it's exploding. So if a lawyer will help you organize, great. If an accountant will help you organize, great. Better still, if you can get a facilitator, someone like Daniel, who's got a lot of expertise here, or some of the others to help come in and help you work through the process and really just manage it for you, to ask the right questions at the right moment in time. That's what we found has been particularly beneficial to organizations, especially upfront. So again, being honest with the resources that you need, what you cannot do, and also if you have to, bring in those outside facilitators to help you work through the process to get to a timely decision.
Yeah, I think I just want to share one of the comments from the audience that agree with Jess, and they actually experienced with a small nonprofit acquired by a larger organization. The lawyer come into the equation relatively late after staff and both organizations spend considerable time understanding how the combined efforts will serve better the client's needs. The lawyer do play a very important role, but at the right time in the conversation. Let's see, there's any other questions or comments we're almost running out of time. I think we have a very wonderful, fruitful conversation today. And actually, we already touched on some of the details about, for example, Daniel talked about the regulatory framework. So since we are running out of time, and another comments I found is that they already contacted the attorney already. They are meeting with a consultant as soon as well. Good, they already started.
Now call me.
So I think that today is serve as a starting point for this topic. And we hope that in the future, we can follow up some other webinars focusing on very specific topic, for example, legal framework and the post-merger cultural integration, sorts of things like that. So today we have a very good conversation as a starting point. And one of the audience asked us, can we leave the contact information? I think that Christina can help us to distribute the contact information so that we can have a follow-up conversation. I think anyway, we very thank you for your participation and two panelists for sharing their insights on this topic. And we look forward to the future conversation on various topics. Okay, thank you so much for participation today.
Great. Thanks, everyone.